Other North Koreas you didn't know about? Hello there! Welcome back to our channel. When we talk about North Korea, we may be talking about the most censored country in the world. With its dictatorship government, socialist policies, and internet isolation, it isn't easy to come to the conclusion that survival within the country is next to impossible. Let's not forget the 90s famine when millions of people were dying, but the government was too concerned about their opium trade and the profits associated with it to care about its people. It is true that North Korea might be one of the worst countries to live in, but the nation has gotten more limelight than the countries that follow similar policies, or even worse, that has made the countries a living hell. Yes, you heard that right. There are other countries in the world that have a similar political structure like North Korea, that favors only the ruling elites and follows crude censorship policies that makes it very hard for other countries to find out what's really going on within the country. This raises a suspicious outlook in the international community with regards to agreements and contracts signed between the two countries, and inevitably leads to the international isolation of the country, making it harder for its residents to survive. Kind of hard to believe that similar hells on earth like North Korea exist in this world, isn't it? Want to know more about the nations, who they are and their policies? Well then, keep watching to find out. 1. Turkmenistan. It wouldn't be wrong to call Turkmenistan an unhealthy blend between Afghanistan and Turkey. Much of the population speaks a similar language, like that of Turks, and their culture resembles their culture, although of older Anatolia, or Turkey, since the latter has long since bypassed the former as it went through a process of intense modernization. The country has a long history dating back into the 19th century, when Russia annexed these lands and became a prominent member of the Soviet Union and Turkmen Soviet Socialist Republic, before regaining its independence in 1991 after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Turkmenistan has proved to be a useful access point for bordering countries due to its geostrategic position within the lands, as it forms an essential part of Central Asia, forming borders with Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and even Iran in the southwest, while having access to the Caspian Sea in the west. However, due to its poor ruling policies and corrupt government, the country hasn't been able to fare well in its economy, with its 6.1 million population that falls below the lines of poverty, despite being a land rich in natural resources. The people of this region actually had an Indo-Iranian origin, where they were first ruled by the Achaemenid Empire of Iran, which was taken over by the Oghuz tribes, who were the first Turkmen, and served under the Seljuk Empire to ensure their rule. After the country regained their independence from Russia in 1991, the nation continued to be ruled by the Turkmen Communist Party official Sapar Murat Niyazov as the president of the country, where all power allegedly lay in his hands. After his death in 2006, two parties were formed in the state of Turkmenistan, which was previously a one-party state, and no opposition was allowed. The Turkmen Communist Party changed its name to Democratic Party of Turkmenistan, and another party was established, the Party of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, in 2012, while an agrarian party appeared 2 years later. The country held its first elections in 2013, which were claimed to be heavily rigged and far from free and fair by the international media and resources. Since all the parties operate under the direction of DPT, there is no real opposition in the Turkmen parliament. Ever since the death of Niyazov in 2006, efforts have been made to open up the government a bit more and give it a more democratic outlook. This can be seen in the addition of parties as well as the passing of a new constitution in 2008, which resulted in the abolition of the council that was hand-picked by the president himself, which then elected the president, constituting no real democracy. The size of the parliament was also increased and also permits the creation of multiple political parties. The judiciary in Turkmenistan is not separate from politics. The constitution of the country permits the president to choose all the judges, including the chief justice, and has the power to dismiss them with the consent of the parliament. The chief justice sits with authority on the State Security Council, and even though the law is freed from constitution under the Articles 98 and 99, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that the judiciary is essentially under presidential control. Apart from that, the foreign policy of the nation is also quite rigid, where it follows a permanent neutrality stance, which the United Nations formally recognized in 1995, and has garnered important relations with neighboring regions like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, and Russia. The country's censorship policy greatly resembles that of North Korea, where the public is banned from protesting against the government and its policies, and both states are known for their blatant human rights violations, as well as their highly centralized governments and known corruption affairs that add to the limelight of the nation. However, some deem Turkmenistan to be a bit better than North Korea, since it does have a little relaxation in its policies when compared to North Korea, where the people have the option to travel abroad, have access to the internet and foreign channels that allow them to stay more up to date with the world. But the state has applied enough sanctions on the people to keep them under control, including their economic policies, that offers very little margin for people to grow financially, unless they become part of the corruption crew plaguing the lands. Eritrea. Like Turkmenistan, Eritrea is still a relatively new country that got its independence in 1993 from Ethiopia, after much struggle against the government that lasted for nearly 3 decades that left the country's resources famished. The country is located in East Africa, with its largest city Asmara, and borders countries like Sudan, Ethiopia, and has an extensive coastline bordering the Red Sea. The country has been attacked by Christians and Muslims alike that fought for dominance over the nation due to the precious reserves it holds within its mountains, where valuable metals like gold, silver, and copper lie, and also because of the easy access to the Red Sea that opened many trade routes. Before Ethiopia, the country was part of the British colony until 1952, where it was decided that its internal affairs would be handled by their own government, but would enter a federal status with Ethiopia for 10 years. This seemed like a reasonable arrangement until the latter decided it wanted to take matters into their own hands and annex the country in 1962. However, the Eritrean people never really accepted the unfair government and instead waged a war against them that lasted for almost 30 years before they gained their independence in 1993, as mentioned before. Despite its imperial history, Eritrea is one of the least developed countries in the region, a one-party presidential republic where elections have never been held. According to the Human Rights Watch, Eritrea's government human rights record is said to be the worst in the world, although the government denies it, claiming the records to be politically motivated. Censorship is also quite high within the country, where the press has next to zero freedom, which might hint at its policies and raise questions regarding the condition of the people, as well as the government's treatment towards them. The country has quite a diverse set of population living within its lands, where the people have been influenced by various religions, thanks to the different groups that have tried to capture the lands from time to time, including Islamic and Christian governments. Apart from that, there is also a small part of the community that follows traditional faiths, since Eritrea is culturally rich and has a long history reaching back into ancient times. This concludes to several historic structures that have been cited within the place, from the Aksum dynasty, as well as religious structures of Christianity, which was the first monotheistic religion brought into the lands, where the oldest monastery that can be cited within the lands is Debre Sina from the 4th century. Similarly, early Islamic structures can also be cited within the lands. From the 7th century, when the Muslims were migrating from Mecca to Medina and decided to build a mosque along the way. This would make it a special place of reverence for modern Muslims if the region was more accessible and the world was more aware about the country. Anyway, moving on to the leadership and government of the country, it has only one party that can rule the lands, and the creation of any other party is banned. Kind of resembles the North Korean Workers' Party, doesn't it? Even if North Korea holds elections, this party remains the one in hold, no matter what. Anyhow, the National Assembly in Eritrea has a total of 150 seats and still holds the same president as it did in its time of independence from Ethiopia. Till record, no national elections and no presidential elections have been organized since that time, equalizing democracy little to zero within the state. This has been taken on record within the United Nations Human Rights Council, which views it as a blatant violation of human rights. In 1993, 75 representatives of the National Assembly were elected, and the rest were appointed. That speaks a lot about the political rule within the country. President Afwerki, the current president of the country, has often expressed his dislike for Western-style democracy and allegedly said in an interview that Eritrea can wait another 3-4 decades before it holds an election again. The human rights situation is also pretty bad within the country, and probably no better than North Korea. The nation is known to be one of the most underdeveloped countries in the world, where most of its population falls below the line of poverty. The nation is known for its unfair laws that extend to arbitrary arrests and detentions, and lays a ban on all homosexual activities within the region, which implies a hyper-religious environment. You can't even think about protesting within the country, since that will immediately result in an unprecedented amount of jail time without giving you a chance to clear your name. This can easily be observed when we look back at an incident where a group of Eritreans dared to speak out against the government and ask for a democratic dialogue, which resulted in all of the 15 members being arrested, including members of the cabinet, as well as 1,000 others who were thought to be affiliated with them, without giving them a chance to defend themselves. The situation has been criticized at various instances by the United Nations, especially after its conflict with Ethiopia, due to limited freedom of speech and press freedom that brings out the true image of the nation. A large amount of people were arrested due to political differences. These included children below the age of 10, seniors, and those who were too sick to even walk. They were brought to central jails, and many were tortured and even killed, whether due to unmonitored activity or a purposeful blind eye towards such activities, people could not decipher. The Eritrea people also suffered a lot under Ethiopian rule during the Independence War, as well as in 1998, when another war broke out between the two nations. The nation is also known to carry out a number of other human rights violations, other than extrajudicial killings and torture, including prolonged national service, forced labor, sexual harassment, rape, and other servitude practices which are common and widespread within the region. Even though the government has termed these as mere claims to defame Eritrea, questions arise as to why there is so much censorship within the country when they have got nothing to hide. Why is the same government ruling over the nation despite the constitution allowing the formation of other parties? Why do people get arrested for voicing their political opinion? These are all important questions that the officials have failed to answer successfully, as the world continues to eye the nation suspiciously, and with all good reason too. 3. Cuba. Cuba is probably one of the closest islands to North Korea and an openly socialist state with an authoritarian regime where the formation of an opposition party within the parliament is not allowed. The island is located between the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean, east of Florida and Bahamas, west of Hispaniola, and north of Jamaica and the Cayman Islands. The country is mainly a group of islands, ruled by the largest while being inhabited by 11 million people, making it the second most populous region within the Caribbean after Haiti. The region has a long history dating back to the 4th millennium BC, inhabited by the Taino and Guanahatabey people when it was captured by the Spanish Empire and ridden of slavery in the 15th century. This was the case until 1898, when the Spanish-American Wars broke out and the Americans took over before the Cubans regained their independence in 1902. The state tried implementing a new constitution in 1940, which resulted in widespread political unrest that led to military dictatorship in 1959 known as the Cuban Revolution, led by Fulgencio Batista. But we'll talk more about this later on. First, let's talk about its form of government and its policies. The state was declared to be a socialist republic in the 1976 Constitution, with a Marxist-Leninist ideology, and declared the Communist Party of Cuba the leading force of the society and the state. The Marxist-Leninist ideology and its concept of democratic centralism is clearly reflected in the political structure of the Cuban government, where the first secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba has the highest authority in the parliament, ruling both the Politburo and the Secretariat. Members of both the councils are elected by the National Assembly of People's Power. Even though the country holds elections, the process is far from democratic. Each seat in the National Assembly has only one candidate, and each of the candidates are nominated by committees strictly controlled by the Communist Party. The military is by far the strongest institution within the country, where it has been termed as a militarized society in the Democracy Dictatorship Index. One of the developments the political rule in Cuba has witnessed is the shortening of the presidential rule in the country, thanks to President Raúl Castro when he resigned in 2018, where the president couldn't take the office more than 2 times. In terms of foreign policy, the island fares much better than North Korea, which remains internationally isolated, even though it achieved its independence much earlier than Cuba. International relations of the island remain unique for a country of its size, where it has been very active in international politics. This includes the wars in Algeria during the years 1961-1965, as well as Angolan civil wars, where the state sent tens of thousands of troops to the country in order to help them stem the war. Other states that Cuba was heavily involved include Ethiopia, Guinea, Mozambique, and Yemen. The state also resumed its relations with the European Union in 2008 and became the founding member of the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas, an organization based on the idea of political and economic integration of Latin American and Caribbean countries. 1996 marked the rejuvenation of relations between Cuba and the US when Bill Clinton passed the Cuban Liberty and Democracy Act, an initiative which was furthered by Barack Obama in 2009, where the president aimed to reverse Bush's administration's prohibition on travel and remittances by Cuban Americans from the United States to Cuba. Soon afterwards, an agreement was signed between the US and Cuba, which is popularly known as the Cuban Thaw, in which Canada and Pope Francis played an eminent part, that began the process of restoring relations between the two nations, which resulted in the opening of embassies in the capitals of both states. Cuba agreed to release the political prisoners, while the US began the process of building a Cuban embassy in Havana. However, ever since the Ukraine-Russia war, tensions between the two countries escalated again as Cuba continued to maintain its ties with Russia, being one of the few nations that did, which led to the closure of its embassies within the US. The embargo imposed on Cuba by the US has been the longest ever in history, which has continued for 6 decades, counting down from 1960. As far as human rights are concerned, Cuba isn't as bad as North Korea in the ranks, but doesn't fare particularly well too. This is mainly because it has pretty much the same law concerning press and ranks 17 on the list of countries with the most imprisoned journalists. Many human rights violations have occurred as a result of the economic crisis the country has been going through, which resulted in country-wide protests. Due to the censorship policies, many of the participants were detained under arbitrary arrests, which incurred outrage from both international media and fueled the anger of the natives. The country of islands may be slightly better in terms of foreign policy, and the government might be a bit fairer than North Korea. However, the press and censorship laws are equally worse, so it wouldn't be wrong to say it is another close country that needs attention. 4. Bhutan. The last but certainly not the least on our list of countries like North Korea. Bhutan is a landlocked country in the Himalayas, bordered by China in the north and India in the south. Like the rest of the countries on our list, Bhutan carries out a strict censorship policy and is very secretive about its affairs, where only 100,000 tourists are allowed within the lands in a year to safeguard its secrecy. The country spans on a minute scale, ranking as one of the least populous regions on the earth. Bhutan is a constitutional monarchy ruled by a king, the head of state, and a prime minister, who is the head of government. It also has a state religion, Vajrayana Buddhism, with a head of state religion, Jirkenpo, who looks over the religious matter of the country. The natural beauty of the region is definitely a noticeable feature of the lands, with 7,000-meter high peaks and diverse wildlife that makes it a memorable escape for travel. Too bad it isn't open for many tourists due to its secretive policies. The region also has the tallest unclimbed mountain in the world. The credit which might also go to the lack of tourists within the lands, where many of the areas might not even be accessible. Despite sharing a similar ethnicity, culture and religion with their neighboring state Tibet, the two countries have been involved in both small and big skirmishes with one another. The country joined the United Nations in 1971 and was one of the first nations to recognize Bangladesh. The kingdom has been very careful concerning its own status and reputation in the international world, where it accepted British rule in the 20th century, keeping in mind the interests of the region, since the British rule would protect the region from neighboring hostile nations like independent Tibet and Qing China. It became more concerned about its status after the China Communist Revolution, swiftly after which the country annexed Tibet and made it part of China. Bhutan's relationship with Nepal remains somewhat strained, especially after a group of Nepali language-speaking refugees fled to Nepal after demanding their rights from the government. While Bhutan has made strides towards democratization, it has experienced periods of authoritarian rule in its history. However, since the transition to a constitutional monarchy, there have been efforts to promote democracy and political freedoms, but within certain limits. The kingdom has maintained especially good ties with India as a close neighbor, where it signed a friendship treaty with India soon after its independence, and the agreement was renewed in 2007, in which the national interests of both countries were safeguarded and allotted greater sovereignty to Bhutan regarding its foreign affairs than the previous treaty, where the latter encouraged a joint cooperation between the two nations, rather than giving India the voice of authority on how Bhutan should proceed with its international relations. Although the kingdom does not have formal diplomatic relations with China, the visits between the two countries have become more frequent, and honorary consulates have been set up by Bhutan in the special administrative regions in Hong Kong and Macau after their bilateral agreement in 1998. The tension between the two countries arises mainly due to border disputes between the two countries where China lays claim to some regions, while Bhutan lays to others. This issue was fueled in late 2005 when Chinese soldiers entered the disputed region of 269 kilometers and started building roads. When approached by the Bhutanese officials to inquire into such activities, the Chinese government denied any knowledge of soldiers, and one of the Chinese delegates in the Bhutanese office said they were simply overreacting. Some might say that Bhutan is not the worst when it comes to human rights, since it does grant a degree of freedom to its population, where it recently decriminalized homosexuality in 2020. However, the women face the same level of discrimination as it did in the previous times, confined to traditional roles, while remaining absent in state and economic affairs. Some improvements have been made in their status where they are given more opportunities in educational institutions and larger representation within the assemblies. The state is also known for the targeted killing and persecution of Nepali-speaking refugees from Bhutan, also known as Lot Champas, as well as various policies that were determined to restrict the rights of this particular group. Overall, there aren't much similarities between the North Korea and Bhutan. However, the latter follows the same secrecy in its policies as the former. Although its motives may be more noble, since the kingdom mainly aimed to safeguard its culture and heritage, while Korea's main objective is to strengthen its totalitarian rule. Conclusion: North Korea is definitely one of the most difficult states to survive in. But who knew there were other states that followed more or less the same policies? Sure, there are some notable differences where North Korea might seem a bit more extreme in its authoritarian rule, as well as its censorship policies. But the truth is that all states have some sort of rules and regulations through which they sought to limit the public. For example, Eritrea and Turkmenistan both have totalitarian governments and both hold elections. But do they hold any value when the process is far from free, fair, or democratic? And these are just some of the countries which have been discussed. Who knows? There might be more secluded ones with even worse policies than North Korea that haven't made it to the spotlight, because frankly speaking, we don't even know the whole truth behind North Korea and how it works, thanks to its lucrative press laws that throw a person behind bars simply for disagreeing with the government. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more such valuable content. Until next time, until next time, until next time.